Welcome everybody to the first video in this series where we're going to be building a full stack application and implementing end-to-end type safety while we do so. Now, if you aren't familiar with what end-to-end type safety is, this is the idea that you have a single source of truth for the types in your application, and this will cover both the front-end application and the back-end application. So if you have a type in either of those locations, it should be kept in sync with the other location. This will help eliminate bugs. It'll help the developer experience be a lot smoother, because now when your data is traveling through your application from maybe your API to your front end, you can be sure that those types are in sync and that you know exactly what shape the data is in. So we're going to be implementing that on a full stack application in this series. And to do so, we're going to be using React, and we're going to build a GraphQL API to feed this React application. And then we're going to be using Prisma to look at our database schema and generate some types for our API based off of that schema. And then of course there's going to be a couple of other cool tools that we're going to sprinkle in there that help tie all of these little pieces together. And we'll get into the details of that a lot more as we go through this series. But in this video specifically, we're going to be building the front-end application, and we're going to be building this in a very simple way. We're going to manually define some types, we're going to mock out some data, and then we're going to build our actual UI for our application. Now, this is just going to be the very first step in type safety, and what this part of the video is really going to be is just showing you how manually written types where there might be some drawbacks there. So we're going to go through the motions of building this application, and we're going to see the manually written types and talk a little bit about where that might go wrong in the future as we build this full stack application. And then by the end of this series, we're going to be building the GraphQL API, and we're going to, of course, implement end-to-end type safety and get rid of these manually written types. And then the goal is to have a fully in-sync end-to-end type safe application at the end. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual project that we're going to be building. If you look over at the screen that I'll be showing now, this is what our application is going to look like. It's a very simple, just display-only application. We're going to have some data seeded into our database, and we're just going to display a list of users, and then each of those users is going to have a set of notes associated with it, and we'll be displaying those here in sort of this tree view. And the way we're grabbing this data is we'll be grabbing it from a GraphQL API that we're going to build. So this is just the sample little playground, and I'll bump this up a little bit. And what you see here is just a simple query, grabbing some data. So this is what we're going to be building later on in the series. This specific video will be focused on the UI part here. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual project and get started. Before we do get started, though, we need to look at what we need to actually run our application and get started here. So the number one thing that you're going to need when you are working through this series is Node.js installed on your machine. A lot of people have this already, so you might, but if not, go over to the nodejs.org website, and then I would click this long-term support version here, and that'll walk you through a wizard to install Node.js on your machine. We're going to be using a couple of different tools that use Node extensively, and React and our GraphQL server are all going to run on Node, so this is going to be important in what we do here. So go ahead and make sure that's installed, and then come back to this video. Alright, so now that you've got Node.js installed, we can go ahead and start building out this application. Now, as we go through this, there will be the expectation that you have some knowledge of working with JavaScript. We are going to be building a React application, so this will be beyond just like basic vanilla JavaScript. So if you aren't already familiar with working with React and with working with TypeScript a little bit, I do recommend you go maybe watch a couple of tutorials on it. If not, though, I will try to explain everything in as great of detail as I can, so hopefully you should be able to follow along anyways. But if you ever do get confused throughout this series, definitely feel free to pause it and just go maybe Google something that you're hung up on. But to get started here, we're going to be actually using a tool called Vite, and this is what's going to generate our application for us. We're going to be able to pass Vite a template, and it's going to scaffold out a whole React application for us with TypeScript installed and integrated into the application. And then it's going to come with a couple of other cool things like a build command, a preview command, and just a bunch of other things that we would normally have to set up on our own, but Vite does it for us, and it does it really quickly too. So in order to do this, you don't actually have to install any packages. You could just run the command npm create Vite at latest, and then I'm going to call this project React Client. So we'll do React-Client. This will be the folder name that your React application is going to live in. And then we're going to do a -- and space -- template. So this is how we tell Vite which template we want to use. And then we're going to use the React-TS template. This is just a simple React template with TypeScript installed. And so I'm going to go actually into Prisma Playgrounds, and I'm going to run that command here. So make sure you run this wherever you want your application to live, because this will create a folder where you tell it to. So I'll go ahead and hit enter on that, and it's already done. So it's scaffolded out this application. What we're going to see in a second is that it's given us a whole project, and we're going to open that up in VS Code. And it actually gives you the instructions on how to do that here. So I'll go into React Client like it tells me above, and then I'll go ahead and just install the dependencies. So I'll do npm install, and then this might take a couple seconds, so I'll pause the video and come back once it's finished. All right, that's finished up. And then the very next thing that I'm going to do is open up the project in VS Code. Now I have the VS Code CLI installed, so I can just run code . But if you don't have the CLI installed, feel free to just open it however you're comfortable. And here we go. So this is the project that Vite built out for us. We can see it's got the normal structure for a React application. We've got a source folder here, and it has a bunch of different files for us that it's created. It's already set up sort of a little template, and we can actually view this template and see it running if we open up a terminal and run npm run dev. I'll pop this guy open, and we should see the starter template. This is what Vite gives you to work with right off the bat. And as you can see here, we are using TSX files, so this is a TypeScript project. And so this is all really good to go. This is ready for us to start working in. The only thing that isn't quite ready is we need to sort of clean this up, because Vite gives us a fully scaffolded out application, but that also means that there's a lot of things in here that we aren't quite going to need. So what I'm going to do is delete this assets folder in the source directory that has just a couple of different assets that the template uses that Vite gives us. We won't really need that, so we're just going to delete that guy. And then same with app.css. We will be using TailwindCSS in this project to style our application, so we don't need any manually defined CSS classes. And then what that will mean is if we open app.tsx, we can see that we were importing some things from those files here. We can go ahead and delete those. And then I'm also going to get rid of this counter, so we can remove the useState dependency. And then finally, everything within here, all of this JSX, I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm just going to give it an H2 that says, hello world. Very typical, but we just want this to be a clean slate for us to work with as we move forward in this video. So now if we go back to the browser, if I pop this open, we should just see hello world. That's all we really need right now. We don't need anything fancy. We're going to be building this application all by ourselves. The last thing I'll point out before we start actually building this is over in package.json, we can see that Vite gave us a couple of cool commands. This dev command that we've already run to start our development server runs Vite. It gave us a build command, so this will actually build our application for like a production build if we wanted to deploy this. And then it gave us a preview command, which will allow us to preview a build. So it came with a lot of cool things already for us. Normally we'd have to go through the process of setting all this up by ourselves, but we get to skip all that now because Vite's super cool and it runs super fast. So it makes sense that it's one of the more popular tools nowadays for this. All right, cool. Now that we've got a general idea of what Vite gave us to work with and we've cleaned up their template a little bit, now we can get going on to some of the funner pieces of this. The very first thing that we're going to do, and it will be more of an initial step before we start actually building our application, is we need to set up TailwindCSS in the project because we will be using that pretty extensively to style our application. So we can go ahead and get started doing that by opening up a terminal window. And in order to work with Tailwind CSS, we do need to install a couple of its dependencies and its required dependencies. So I'll list those out here. We're going to do npm install, and Tailwind CSS will run in development mode, but not in production, so we can install them as development dependencies. And we're going to need 3 dependencies to work with. So we need the actual Tailwind CSS CLI, so this will allow us to run Tailwind commands to build our Tailwind assets. And then Tailwind CSS's CLI relies on post CSS, so we need to install that. And then finally we need auto prefixer, which is just a library that Tailwind CSS is going to use to build some of its assets. So we can go ahead and install all of those, and once that's installed we should be ready to go. So we can now run npx tailwind css init-p, and this will initialize Tailwind CSS in our project. And I'm going to open up this sidebar before I actually run this so that we can see what happens. So there we go. This says that it created a Tailwind CSS config file for us and a post CSS config file for us. And those showed up right here. The one that we're going to care about is this tailwind css.config.cjs. This is where we can configure Tailwind CSS to give it different options. We can extend it. And more importantly, and what the piece that we're going to use is this content key right here. This is going to allow us to tell Tailwind CSS which files it needs to care about. The way Tailwind works is when it runs a build, or when we actually build Tailwind CSS, it's going to scan through our code and it's going to try to find any classes or utilities that we're using from the Tailwind CSS library. And then it'll take all those classes and it'll bundle them up into a file and serve it with our application. This is super cool because that means we aren't actually building out the entire Tailwind CSS library and shipping it with each deployment of our application. It's instead only picking the pieces that we actually use and the pieces we actually need and serving that instead. But in order for that to actually work, we need to tell it which files it needs to care about when it's scanning for those classes. So the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to give this content array a blob, and that blob's going to point to all the files that we care about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type source, because we only want to look at files that are in this source directory over here. And then within that, we want to tell Tailwind CSS that we don't care how deeply nested the file is, just look through all of the folders and files as far down as it can go. And then lastly, we need to tell it that within all of those folders that it's searching through, we only want to care about the .tsx files because that's the only places where we're going to actually be using Tailwind CSS. So with that there, we are now telling it where to look, and we can actually try to test this out now. So if we go over to index.css over here, we need to actually clear all this out. This is more just template code that Vite gave us. And then I'm going to paste something in, and I'll talk through a little bit of what this does. We need to actually import Tailwind CSS's utilities. So if we look at this, there's an attribute called @tailwind, and then we pass it base, components, and utilities. So this is just importing a bunch of different pieces that Tailwind CSS needs to actually work. So now that we've got that done, we should be able to actually test this out and use Tailwind CSS in our application. So what I'm going to do is just paste another piece of code in that I've prepared to just make sure that this is actually working. I'll close this sidebar. So what we've got here is we've just got a div, and I'm giving it a bunch of different styles. And I've picked these styles specifically because these will be useful later on in our application. But essentially I'm just giving it a background color. I'm giving it a height and width so it takes up the full screen. I'm making it a flex div so that everything's going to be using flexbox, and it'll be in the column direction. And then finally I'm just centering and spacing things. If you're curious about these specific classes and what they do, I won't go over each of them in too much detail throughout this series, but the Tailwind CSS docs actually has some really good information on how each of these works, so definitely check that out if you're curious. But within that div, I've just got a really big yellow h2 tag that says hello world. So if we run this again, I think I closed down the dev server at one point. If we pop this guy open, we should see now that we get this nice gray screen with a yellow hello world in the middle. That tells us Tailwind CSS is working and configured properly, and we should be ready to start building our application. So if we start thinking about the steps that we need to take next, we need to actually build our UI components, and then we need to display some data. And like I said at the beginning of the video, we're going to be using sort of mock data. We're not actually going to be using data from an API because we don't have one yet. So I think the first step that we're going to take here is we need to start thinking about the shape that our data is going to be in. We need to define some TypeScript types to model out our data. And then after that, we will actually mock out some of that data. And after that point, that's when we'll build our UI components. We want to get all these little pieces prepared and ready to go before we actually start doing the work. So let's go ahead and do that now. Heading back over to our code, I'm going to open up this window here and I'll create a new file called types.ts. I've named it this because this is where we're going to be storing any types that we have in our application. That way they're all sort of built in one place. That will make it a little bit easier later on in the series as we start to replace these manually defined types with the automatically generated ones. So thinking about our data, if you think back to the UI, we have users and messages. So these are our sort of two different data domains that we've got to figure out and define the shape of. And so what I'm going to do very first here is I'll do an export type, and we're going to have a message type. And this message type is, as you might expect, it's going to define the shape of our message data or a message object. And in the UI that I showed you, we only actually displayed the body of a message. So the only key that we're going to need to worry about here is called body. Now this may seem pretty simple, and it may seem like, why would you even define a type if there's only one key? But if you think about a real-world application, there may be dozens or more keys. So this becomes really important as your data grows and changes. And actually, as we build out our API, there will be different keys that we might want access to in the front end, and those will end up being automatically generated and spit out here. So just setting up this structure will help us sort of prepare for that. The next piece of data that we have is a user, so we'll create a new type and export it, and we'll call this user. And this user is going to have a name, which will also be a string, but it's also going to have an array of messages because each user can have many messages. So I'll create a messages key, and this will be a message array. So this should contain an array of message objects. And as far as our types go, that's all we really needed. That's all the data that our application is going to worry about. So with this in place, we should be ready to now actually mock out our data. We've got the types ready. We know what shape our data is going to be in, and now we can actually mock it out. And where we're going to do that is in our app.tsx. The reason we're going to do that here is because eventually when we actually have an API to query, we're going to do that query within this file and get our query results within this app function. So might as well get the mock data in the same place. That way our application's as close to real as we can get it before we actually have an API to work with. So we need to mock out an array of users because we are going to display one user, or I guess one element for each user. So before we do that, let's import a new type. We'll import that user type that we just created from types. And then within our app function here, we're going to create a new constant called users, and this should be an array of user objects. And then because we did define our types, we get this nice type safety here. We can actually see the different keys that we have available to us. So we have our name and our messages. So I'll give it a name, and this will just be save in atoms. And then messages, this is also an array. And we'll give it a body that says, hey there. And then let's go ahead and give this a second message as well. And this will have another body. And let's just say, what's up? Cool. So that's really all we need for our mock data. We don't need to get too complicated here. We've just got one user with two messages, and that'll allow us to build out the UI. We'll be able to build the user display component. We'll be able to build our message component, and then sort of those tree branches that I showed you that connect the two. So that's all we needed as far as our data mocking. And now we're ready to actually start building our UI components. So let's jump into that now. The first component that we'll build is the component that actually just displays a user itself. Now the UI that we have is just going to display the user's name, but it's going to be in a nicely styled div that's sort of a rectangle shape with rounded corners. So let's go ahead and build that piece now. I'm going to go over to the source directory over here and create a new folder called components. This is where any component that we're going to build is going to live. And if you think back to our Tailwind config, we're looking in the source folder and any nested folders as well. So TailwindCSS should be able to pick up on classes we use within this folder. So I'm going to create a new file here, and it's called user_display.tsx. And this user display is going to be a React component, so I will create a new function called user display, and then I will export user display. And let's actually make this a default export. So now that we've got this sort of skeleton of a function, let's think about what we need. So this is going to be a user display. So we are going to need to pass this a user so we can actually display a user's data. And this will take in a single user. So let's actually import our user type. We'll import type user from, and we'll go up a directory and get the types. And then if you are familiar with React, you'll know that once we build a component, we can pass components props. So properties, we can basically pass it data to use within the component from the parent. So when we actually go in our app.tsx and we render out a user display for each user, we can pass that component the user object. But we need to actually do this in a type-safe way. We want to make sure that the object we're passing it is a user object. So we're going to create a new type here called props. And this props is only going to have one key in it. It's going to be user, and it should have a user object. And what we can do with that now is we could say we have props here, and it should be of the props type. And then to make this even a little bit easier, we're going to destructure this props, and we're just going to pull out this user key. That'll give us some really easy access to our user data. So now when we do the user display component in our app.tsx file, we're going to be able to pass it a user, and we'll give it some user data, and it will allow us to get that type safety when we're passing in this object. It'll let us know if that object is valid or not. So we've got our user display component, we've got this whole skeleton sort of built out, but we're currently not actually rendering anything. So we'll need to return, and then this is going to be just some JSX that I will paste in here. And there we go. So we've got this nice component here, and this is going to display our data in that pretty way that I showed you before. And like I said earlier, I won't go into too much detail what each of these classes is doing, but I will show them here in case you need to copy this down. There's also a series of blog posts that go along with these videos. So if you ever do want to actually copy and paste something, all of these different code steps are going to be in that blog post. So you can pop that open. The link's going to be at the bottom of this video. And then you can sort of pause and just copy and paste this over. And if you're curious about how these classes are working or what they're actually doing, feel free to also take a look at the docs and then come back to this video and move on forward. But just as a general overview, what this is doing is just providing a nice container for our user's name. It's giving it some rounded styles, nice background color, height and width, and then we're just styling our p tag. So there's not a whole lot of crazy stuff going on, but it just uses a lot of classes, so it might look kind of scary. But now that we've got that built in, we've pasted that snippet in there, we're now ready to actually render one of these components for our user. So if we go back to app.tsx, we can get rid of this h2 tag that we built here, and instead we'll replace it with a code block. And we're going to map over our users array. So we'll do users.map, and this is going to have a user. And we're also going to pull out the index key, which is just a numeric value that gives you the array location of the current user that you're mapping over. We're going to need to do this because React likes to have a unique identifier for each component that's listed using a map like this. And so we're going to use that index key as a unique identifier for each rendered component. So we've got that. Now we can do, we can actually render out our user display component. But before we do that, we need to import it. So we'll import user display from components slash user display. And then we can get that here. We'll do user display, we'll give it a user, and this is going to take in our user object, and we'll give it a key, which is that unique identifier I mentioned, and we'll pass it the index. And there you go. So this code right here is going over each user we have, which currently we only have one, and it's going to pass that user into our user display object and then render it. So if we head back to our browser, we should now see that we get this nice user in the middle. And if we had multiple users, we would see a couple of different ones showing up here. So that's all we need for our user display. The next piece is actually displaying the messages next to each user. So we'll go ahead and build that one next. The component to display our messages is going to be really similar to this user component. So to build it, we'll go back over to our code, and we'll head over to the components directory that we created, and we're going to create a new file there, and it's going to be called message_display.tsx. And I'm actually going to copy over this whole user display because it's going to be so similar, we might as well just reuse what we already wrote. The only difference is that we're going to be passing in a message object instead, so let's call this all message. The function name is going to be message display, and then here of course we're going to be using our message, and then we are going to have new JSX for this, so for now I'll comment that out. This needs to be message display as well. So what we're left with now is just a very similar skeleton to what we started out with before in our user display component, but we do need to tweak this a little bit to cater to the needs of this specific component. Specifically our props, we are going to pass this an extra prop, which is going to be called index, and this is going to be a number value. Now this property is going to be used specifically for rendering those different tree branches that you might have seen at the beginning of this video. If you remember, each user had a couple of messages displayed to the right of it, and there was like these little branches that connected each message to a user. And if you look closely, the very first message has a straight line, and all of the messages after the first one have like L-shaped lines that connect it because they're further down. So what this index number is going to do is it's going to help us determine whether or not this message is the first in the array. That way we know whether we need to render a straight branch or a curved branch. And that'll be in its own component, so we won't actually build that piece now, but we will need this number to build that later on. So that's why that's here. I just wanted to make sure that was clear. But now that we've got that, we can pull that out as well there, and we can actually build our JSX. And once again, I'm going to copy in a little bit of JSX that I've prepared. It's the same situation as the user display where I won't go over all of the individual classes, but it is available to copy paste over in the blog post, so I highly recommend you do that. And it's basically just setting up a couple of different classes to style the container and style the actual message body. The only specific class that I will point out here, though, is this group class. This is going to be used later on with the branch, and it's going to help us get a nice little highlight effect. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we build the branch component. But for now, just know that this is all just sort of styling out the container for our application. But now that we've got that component built out, we can actually use it. So if we head back over to our user display, our user object is going to have this messages property. So we have that data within each user already. So we can actually use that. So if we create a new div here, and we can create a new code block, and similar to the way we did this before, we're going to map over each of our users' messages. So we'll do user.messages.map, and we'll pull out a message and an index. And then for each message, we're going to render a message display. And so we'll need to import that. We'll import message, if I could spell it, display from message display. So we've got that component accessible now, and we will use that here. And we need to pass this our message, and we need to pass this our key, which is an index. There we go, and then this is complaining index is missing. Ah, yes, that's right. So we do have this index key here, so we need to make sure that we pass that in as well. So I'll do index equals index. There, so now that's happy, and we should be all good to go. And I will, just for the sake of showing this, if we just pass like an object with different keys in here, we will get an error, and we're going to say body is missing. That's what the error message is going to say, and that's because we did properly type these component types. So it knows that this will not work. We need to pass it an actual message object, which this is. We can see it has the type message. So now that we're doing that, we should be rendering out each message, and we're using this new component that we built. So if we head back to the browser, now we see those messages. And this is looking really close to our goal. The only thing that we're missing here is those little branches that are going to connect each message to their owner. So let's go ahead and build that piece next. So this component is going to be quite a bit simpler. So if we head back over to our code base, and like we did before, we'll go into the components folder, create a new file, and this one's just going to be called branch.tsx. And what this is going to have in it is a function called branch. And again, we will export this function as a default export. And this branch is going to take in a couple of properties, or actually it's just going to take in one property. And what that's going to be is, it's going to be called trunk. And I'll explain that in a second, but we will have this trunk property, and it's going to be a Boolean. So what that trunk is going to be is just a Boolean value letting the component know if it's the first index of the array or if it's later on. So it's going to be true if it's the first one, if it's the trunk, and that's going to signify to us that we need to render the straight line, not the L shape. And what that's going to look like over here is we're going to basically look at this index, and if it's 0, then it should be the trunk. So that's how we're going to use that. But aside from that, the only thing we really need to do here is actually render out the display. And then once again, I'm going to paste in a couple of JSX elements here. And I'll format that a bit. So this is what we've got. We've got a div here, and I'll go over these bits in just a second. But down below, we've got some scaling operations happening on it, a transition that we're setting up so that we can set up this little nice animation that I'll show in a second. And what that animation is going to do is cause the border of our branches to turn teal. And this is where that group class that I had mentioned previously comes into play. If we go over to our message, we see this group here. And then if we go into branch, we've got a group hover. So what this is going to do is, because we're rendering a branch within our message, so we're actually going to render it right here, that branch now becomes part of this group because it's enclosed in this group class. And what we're essentially saying is that if anything in this group is hovered over, we want the border to turn teal. That way, if we hover over the message or if we hover over the branch, this is going to turn teal for us, and we know exactly what relates and how it relates. And I'll show that in a second, but it's a cool little animation that I wanted to point out so that you know how it's working. We're also using this trunk Boolean that we've got to apply some styles conditionally. So right here we're saying if this is the trunk, to add a border of left, or actually, sorry, if this is not a trunk, to add a border on the left of 4. And this is what's going to render the vertical part of our L. So what these really are is just a box with a bottom border. And if it is not the trunk, we're also going to have a left border, so it gets that vertical sort of branch popping off. And then aside from that, it's pretty simple here. We've just got a couple of conditional classes based on if it's a trunk or not. We need to shift the element over a little bit more if it is a trunk, and we also need to shift the width of it a little bit if it is a trunk. So that's what we're doing there. And that actually completes our branch component, so we can import that into our message display. Import branch from branch, and we can render that here. So we'll render our branch component, and this is going to take in that trunk, and the Boolean that we're going to have is index equals 0. So we're saying if this branch has the 0 index, so if this message is the 0 index, then this should be true for the trunk. Otherwise, it should be false because it's not the trunk. So let's go look at our browser and see what this looks like. And there we go. So we've got this, and you can see these nice little hover animations that happen as I hover over the branches. But also because of that group class, if you hover over the message itself, it'll highlight the branch that's associated with it. So that's a pretty cool little animation there that I wanted to show off. And just to show what's sort of happening under the hood, I kind of alluded to this before, but each of these branches are actually a little box. And the corners, the left and bottom of the L-shaped branch are highlighted because they have a border width. But on the trunk, if we look at that branch, just the bottom has a border. And that's how we're accomplishing this. But with that, we have actually finished out this React application. These are all of the components that we need to build this application. Of course, once we have our GraphQL API, the static data that we have in app.tsx will be replaced with an API response, which would result in probably more users, and those would get displayed here because we are mapping over the entire array. So this is complete, this is ready to go. All we need to do now is build a GraphQL API to feed this, and we'll be covering that in the next parts of this series. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll continue this on in the future videos.